Next, we're going to have Dr. Bill Harris call in, and he's president of OmegaQuant. On your table, there are a couple of kits. So he's going to talk about, now you have heard a little bit about the vast importance for omega-3s for our brain. How do you know if you're getting enough? And so he'll address that. There's no one going to stand up here. We're going to just look at the screens.
Dr. Harris, you're on. Your first slide's on.
Great, thank you. Is the voice coming through okay?
Yes, you're here, loud and clear.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person to do this presentation, but we got scared about a hurricane. In any event, let me move through this. My goal here is to give you some perspective on how much omega-3 really is needed, how much fish is needed to get a healthy omega-3 index. These are data that were presented recently at a ISFAL meeting by Dr. Jackson, part of our team here. And I'll just review this quickly with you. Next slide, please. So in 2018, of course, the American Heart Association put out new fish guidelines for the prevention of cardiovascular disease in the general population. And by way of history, in 2002, the first recommendation set from the AHA came out and pointed to, or suggested at least 2 servings of preferably oily fish per week was the target intake. In 2018, to those of us who really think about these things in detail, it looks like it was downgraded to our consternation to 1 to 2 seafood meals per week without specifically designating high oil fish, although they do that later in the paper. The abstract does not say that. And no EPA and DHA supplements are recommended from the AHA. And so the question, next slide. Publication of the new AHA guidelines prompted Professor Culler from Pitt to write an editorial to ask this question. He says the Japanese consume about 1 gram a day of omega-3 PUFAs compared to 1 to 200 in the U.S. Plasma phospholipid measured N3 PUFA levels in the blood are much higher in the Japanese than the U.S. The key public health question is whether recommended intakes of seafood in the U.S. should be such as to reach the same levels of omega-3 in the blood as in Japan, about 9% of total fatty acids compared to the roughly 4% in the U.S. And I think that was a great question, and that's the question we've tried to address in a study that we've recently completed. So our research question, next slide. Will following the current AHA recommendations for fish intake, 1 to 2 servings of fish or seafood per week, result in a desirable omega-3 index? And just to quickly review what the omega-3 index is, next slide. It's basically a biomarker and a risk factor. The omega-3 index is the EPA and DHA content of red blood cell membranes. And it's expressed as a percent of total fatty acid in the membrane. And having an omega-3 index in the desirable range, which we say is 8 to 12%, has been associated with improved health across several systems. Next slide. The question of why 8%, there's a long story behind 8%, but I think the most recent data we have been able to generate is in this slide called a meta-analysis of the omega-3 index as a predictor of risk for fatal coronary heart disease. This is a study that was done in 10 cohorts worldwide in which the omega-3 index was either measured directly or estimated in over 27,000 people. And what we found, if we compare the omega-3 index of people with an omega-3 index of 4% to those with an omega-3 index of 8% and higher, there was a 35% lower risk for persons with the high omega-3 index compared with those with the low which is consistent with what we've seen in other settings. This is just the largest data set that it's been done in. So our view is that if you really want to optimal health, and put optimal in quotes, 8% would be the target to aim for. And this is just a scale indicating that on the left-hand side, the typical omega-3 index for U.S., European Union, Western populations is in the 4 to 5% area. For Japan, it is, as Dr. Kohler said, up in the 8, 9, 10%, at least has historically been, as Japanese have been eating a traditional Japanese diet. So this is the target we're aiming for. So next slide, we'll review the study, how we did this study. We took de-identified data from dried blood spot samples that were analyzed for the omega-3 index that were sent to OmegaQuant, our laboratory here in Sioux Falls. These were from people who bought the test online, who were patients in different clinics that we service, samples collected at trade shows, people coming to a booth and wanting to get tested. There were some samples from employees at work sites. So it's a wide variety of people that were tested. This was all done between March of last year and January of this year. We took adults only, and people had to complete some very simple questions as well as give us some demographic information. The final data set is around 3,500 people. The questions that all these 3,500 people answered when they submitted their blood tests were these two questions. How often do you eat as a main course tuna or other non-fried fish? And these are the choices from none per week to 3 or more times per week. And do you take an omega-3 supplement? And yes or no. And if it was yes, then they had to choose which of those categories they were taking. We think just for a simple consumer question, this is as detailed as we could get. We would love to have gotten much more deeply involved, but this is as far as we got. But I still think this is quite telling. Next slide. So over half of the cohort was actually taking a supplement, which is far higher than the average American population. So this is a good cohort to ask the question about how omega-3 levels correlate with fish intake and with supplementation use. So about, again, 50% were taking a supplement, and as you can see, the vast majority of those taking a supplement were taking fish oil. Next slide. So 17% of the cohort was eating fish at least twice a week. That's the, as you can see, the twice per week and the 3 or more times per week, the 10% and 7% add to 17%. If you add in the weekly, once a week, that's another 21. So we're up into the near 40% were taking or eating fish 1 or 2 times a week or more, which is again higher than average. But a lot of these samples again came from people who were particularly interested in omega-3 fatty acids. Next slide. Nevertheless, 80% of the cohort still had an omega-3 index that was under 8%. 82% had less than the optimal omega-3 index. So here is our analysis of it by group. Next slide. So this is a somewhat complicated slide. On the y-axis is the omega-3 index with a green dotted line showing where that 8% target is. And across the x-axis, we have the different fish, frequency of fish intake per meal, the different groups, from none per week up to 3 times per week. And then within each fish category, were you taking a supplement or were you not taking a supplement? If you just focus on the blue lines, or the blue columns, you can see that as fish intake went up, the omega-3 index went up, which is, again, a validation of the fact that this is a good marker of at least oily fish intake, which has been shown several times. If you look at the red bars, again, across the range of fish intake, you see these are people reported taking a supplement. And that also goes up in a nice, pretty linear fashion, and you generally people who have an omega-3, people who take supplements have an omega-3 index about 2 units higher than people who don't take supplements across the board here. And we also found that, again, if you just look at the blue columns, there's about a 0.6% increase in the index for every increase in fish intake category. So that's a nice dose response there. Notice how wide the standard deviation bars are. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there is quite a bit of variability. Next slide. Should have a little arrow on the right saying the only group that actually exceeded 8% on average were those who were eating 3 times a week, fish 3 times a week, and taking a supplement. And again, that was just about half of that group. The next slide, or the next pop-up should say the group that was meeting the AHA goal is this group at about 5.8% omega-3 index, who ate fish twice per week but did not take a supplement. So that's about what you might expect from following the AHA guidelines, to be around 5.8 or 6%. Clearly not up at the 8%. Certainly better than 4%, but not as good as it could be. Next slide. This is basically the same data. The blue and red bars are the same blue and red bars as the previous slide, except we have to expand the scale on the left to accommodate the minimum and maximum omega-3 index in these groups. So all the yellow balls above the green line are really the highest level of an individual within each of those groups. I think it's worth pointing out here, if you ask the question to people who are eating 2 or more fish meals a week and not taking a supplement, can they get an omega-3 index over 8? And the answer is definitely yes. We had about 15% of the group that was eating at least 2 fish meals a week. 15% of them were over 8%. So it's very doable with fish alone. You don't have to have a supplement. It's just much more difficult to do it that way. But you can see what a great spread there is in omega-3 index values, even in the people who were reporting no fish meals per week. There were some people who had an index over 8. So there's a lot of noise in this. Next slide. This slide actually asks a different question. This is the likelihood of having a desirable omega-3 index based on fish and supplement use. So how likely are you to have an index over 8% if you fall in these categories? If we start at the far right, the tall red line, 44%. So if you were taking supplements and you reported eating 3 fish meals a week, you were 44% likely to have an omega-3 index over 8, roughly 50%. Which is about what the other data show. And at the other extreme, the far left, the blue bar with 2 on it, if you were not eating any fish and you didn't take a supplement, you had a 2% chance of having an index over 8. So it's, again, pretty clear. The dose response is clear in this particular setting. So I'll summarize here. Next slide. And then next slide. Those people meeting the current recommendations of 1 to 2 servings a week and having an omega-3 index of 5%. Would you answer this? Had an omega-3 index of 5 to about 6% and had a 4 to 10% chance of having a desirable level. Next slide. So on average, people eating at least 3 fish servings per week and taking an EPA DHA supplement had an omega-3 index of about 8%. Next slide. There was high variability in the omega-3 index within each fish and supplement category. And that's due to a lot of things. Certainly biologic variability, which is a placeholder for ignorance, actually. And certainly a lack of detail on the kinds of fish that people assume when they think about non-fried fish. We certainly don't know about compliance when we say people, or ask people if they take supplements. We didn't ask them how much, how many, what kind, how often. It's just a yes/no question, and there's quite a bit of variability in intake from there. Next slide, next button. So basically, the omega-3 status really can't be guessed. If you really want to know which your omega-3 levels, you have to measure them. But I think we still have some more information here about really what it takes to get up to really healthy omega-3 levels. So I'll stop with that, and if there are any questions, happy to answer them. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.